Welcome to this evening's cultural seminar, Ireland and the First World War. We are delighted to welcome back Jim O'Hara, history lecturer and founder of the Irish Studies Centre at St Mary's University College, London. It's great, thank you, Jim. Thank you. I'd like to give you a little bit of information on Jim O'Hara. Jim was born in Belfast and educated at St Mary's Christian Brothers Grammar School, Queen's University, Belfast, Queen Mary's College, University of London. He has been a history lecturer in various universities in Britain and in 1990 established the Irish Studies Centre, a founder at St Mary's University College, Strawberry, Twickenham, becoming its first director. He is a founder member of the British Association of Irish Studies, as well as the European Federation of Centres for Irish Studies, and is a former chairman of the Irish Youth Foundation. He is current committee member of the Irish Government's Emigrant Support Programme, and is also chair of the Irish Cultural Centre in Hammersmith. Jim will make the presentation, and he will speak for 40 minutes to approximately 8:10. I will see how it goes. There will then be a break for about half an hour, 20 minutes, half an hour, and then there will be a question and answer session afterwards. We will come back for that. I'm Noreen Kellett. Tonight I'm doing this for our chair, Tom Scanlon, who's ill. Thank you very much. I'll hand over to Jim now.
Thank you, Noreen. I mean, I'm happy to use the microphone, but if you can hear me just without the microphone, I prefer to do that. Okay. Is that all right? Can people hear me?
That's great. Yes.
No? Okay. If you want me to use the mic, just let me know. I'll do so. First of all, Noreen, thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you very much for inviting me back again. It's always nice to be invited back after you've gone somewhere first. It means you haven't made a total mess of it the first time. And I know you've got a very interesting series of lectures that have been going on here in the Luton Irish Centre over the last couple of years, and I'd like to congratulate you that and the rest of the committee on organising such a great series of lectures. I know there a few months ago you had the ambassador here as well. My topic today is Ireland and the Great War. And just to kick off, I put three images there on the screen. One is, most of you probably know, it's a poster of John Redmond saying, "Your first duty is to take your part and end the war. Join an Irish regiment today." The middle poster is a poster showing the 36th Ulster Division with its insignia with the crown on top, the cross of St Patrick, the Union Jack, the harp of Ireland, and the red hand of Ulster, and then the 9 shamrocks of the 920s of Ulster. And over here on the right hand side is a recruiting poster, one of the recruiting posters that was used in Ireland. Will you answer the call? And here you have a bugler sounding the call with a woman who presumably is casting the hula on Russian dew, saying to her men, "Now is the time," and the place is the nearest recruiting office. Well, if you look at go back to the First World War, when the war broke out in 1914, few people realised what a profound effect the war was going to have on Ireland, on Europe, and indeed in the world. I mean, if you look what happened in those 4 years, and the collapse of some of the great empires in the world, the Russian Empire, the Romanov Empire, which had been there for centuries, collapses in 1917 and replaced with the Bolshevik Revolution of Lenin. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Habsburg Empire, collapses in 1918. The German Empire, which had been founded in 1870, disappears at the end of the war in 1918. And the Turkish Empire, the Ottoman Empire, which again had been there for hundreds of years, both in Europe and in Asia Minor, the Turkish Empire disappears. And so the whole map of Europe, and indeed the map of the Middle East, is changed as a result of the First World War. And of course, it was inevitable that Ireland would be so affected. But if you consider Ireland in the 19th century and you say that the two great seminal events for Ireland in the 19th century were the Act of Union in 1800 and the famine in the 1840s, then I think likewise in the 20th century you can, I think, look at the Great War as really one of the most key central experiences of 20th century Ireland. And how does that happen? Well, I've got, let's see when I can work this. Yeah, a few points up here on the screen which I hope are going to be the basis of what I'm going to say, which hopefully you'll be able to read. The Great War transforms the Irish question. In what way? Well, in 1914, the vast majority of Irish nationalists accepted that Home Rule would be within the United Kingdom. And this was something that had been there from the time of Parnell. By 1918, 4 years later, however, the majority of nationalists apparently supported the establishment of an Irish Republic outside the British Empire. And it's the war that really catapults Irish republicanism from being very much a minority obsession into a potential form of self-government for Ireland. In 1914, the most important party in Ireland was the Home Rule Party, or the IPP, the Irish Parliamentary Party, led by Redmond. And this represented the vast majority of people in Ireland, certainly the vast majority of Irish nationalists. By 1918, however, this party is virtually wiped out, and it's replaced by Sinn Féin, who had no MPs or no members of Parliament in 1914. And they replace Redmond's party. And so what this conflict of 1914-1918 does really, it crystallises the differences between the two strands of nationalist opinion in Ireland. The Home Rule Party, the constitutional nationalists, and the separatists as represented by Sinn Féin and the Irish Republican Brotherhood. And it's the war really that provides the opportunity for the Irish Republican Brotherhood to launch a rebellion in 1916. And of course this produces a pretty ruthless reaction from the British government. Also, it's the war which leads to the foundation of a coalition government in Britain in 1915. And the formation of that coalition government has profound consequences for the Home Rule Party and raises, of course, again, and solidifies this whole question of partition. It's the war that also leads to the threat of conscription in Ireland in 1918 and produces a very hostile reaction from Irish nationalists when the British government attempts to do this. And the whole concept of partition, which in many ways was almost inevitable by 1914, this is reinforced by the Ulster Unionist reaction to the war and by the coalition governments in 1915. Because war tends to do two things. War can unite a country together, and so everyone comes together for the common cause. Or what war can do, it identifies and emphasises the splits that exist within a country. And in Ireland, this is what the war tended to do. It emphasised the split between the constitutional nationalists and those people who wanted a republic, and emphasised the split between Ulster Protestantism and the Irish Catholic nationalist majority. So, let's have a look at Ireland before August 1914. Before 1914, Asquith was in power in Britain with his Liberal government. And the Liberal government depended on John Redmond's Home Rule Party for its majority in the House of Commons. And in return for that support, Redmond had extracted from Asquith the promise to introduce a Home Rule Bill. And the Home Rule Bill was introduced in 1912 and was due to come into operation in 1914. It was vigorously opposed, of course, by the Conservative Party and by the Ulster Unionist Party led by Edward Carson. The Conservatives believed this was a corrupt parliamentary bargain. Here was Asquith's Liberals, here were the Irish Home Rule MPs, got together in this corrupt bargain whereby the Irish would keep Asquith in power and in return he was going to give them that Home Rule. And so there was no way in which the Ulster Unionists could oppose this constitutionally. And so they refused to accept. They say they're not going to accept this Home Rule Bill when it becomes operative. They threaten to set up a provisional government. They set up an illegal paramilitary force, the Ulster Volunteers, very soon they've got 100,000 men, and they say that they're going to resist Home Rule by force if necessary. And so what they were doing, by so doing, the Ulster Unionists were bringing politics out onto the streets. It wasn't possible to defeat Home Rule in Westminster, therefore the only other way to do it was on the streets. And of course this was a serious threat to the British government's authority. And Asquith is a weak Prime Minister. He vacillates, he doesn't want to make any decisions on this. He is known for his inaction, for his weakness. And this of course is seen by the Ulster Loyalists as vindicating their actions. And this was Ulster's revolution. I mean, if you talk about which was the first group really to revolt in Ireland, in that sense it was Ulster. They rejected the British Parliament's authority, even though the government had the mandate from the House of Commons. And of course this encouraged then the Irish nationalists to set up their own paramilitary force, the Irish Volunteers, which they do, because they want to defend the constitutional rights of the Irish people, and they want to put pressure on Britain to keep to its promise to introduce Home Rule. So the whole question of Home Rule raises the stakes in Ireland, and you've got now these two groups. And inevitably, the Ulster Unionists want to get armed. And so they go to Germany, they buy arms from Germany. The Germans are quite happy to give arms to the Ulster Unionists, which they do, and they land them successfully. They're the first ones to introduce really the gun into Irish politics. Because what's the point of having a paramilitary force if it is without arms? And the Irish Volunteers do the same thing. They also go to Germany, they buy guns and land them, not as much as the Ulster Unionists did. But you've now got two private armies in Ireland ready to fight each other over the question of Home Rule being introduced or over the refusal to accept Home Rule. So there's a real threat of disaster here for the British government. There's a real threat of civil war taking place within months in Ireland, and inevitably, of course, if there had been a civil war in Ireland, it was going to spill over into Britain. It wasn't going to just stay in Ireland. Just in many ways, the same way as the Troubles in Northern Ireland when they first began, eventually, of course, spilled out over here in Britain. And that whole situation was made worse by the Curragh Mutiny of March 1914. And I sometimes think that that mutiny is downplayed in some of the history books. Because here were the leading officers in the British Army in Ireland, in the Curragh camp, which was the headquarters of the British Army in Ireland. Here were 60 out of 70 of the senior officers in Ireland, of the British Army, saying that they would resign rather than take action against Ulster, rather than forcing Ulster and the Ulster Protestants to accept Home Rule. Now, no orders were actually given, but nevertheless the key point is that an elite corps of British Army officers had revolted against the Irish policy of the established government. And that threatened the whole concept of a non-political army in Britain. It has always been part of the British tradition that the army was not political. In this case, you had some of the leading officers in Ireland clearly taking a political stance. It meant therefore that Asquith, the Prime Minister, and the Liberal government were under real pressure, because how were they going to use, well, they couldn't use, the armed forces to impose Home Rule upon a reluctant Ulster. Next one. So, Britain really is on the brink of civil war by March 1914. And Asquith doesn't know how to handle the situation. And in some ways he's very lucky, because he's actually rescued from this Irish morass by the conflict that breaks out in August of 1914. And that puts the whole Irish situation in a very different context. Because what the war does, it defuses the Ulster situation. Home Rule is therefore put on ice. And it meant that the parties could come together for a greater cause, the supreme cause, and that is to say, the defence of the United Kingdom and to achieve victory over Germany. That they could concentrate not on what divides them, but on the patriotic cause that unites them. And war, in this sense, was the defining moment, really, for the political fortunes of Redmond and the Irish political party. Because it posed for them the very dangerous question is what was Redmond's position going to be vis-à-vis the war? And Redmond's position was ambiguous. On the 3rd of August, the day before war was declared, Redmond declared and offered Asquith's government the support of nationalist Ireland in the form of the Irish Volunteers. And this was a gesture of goodwill by Redmond. It was calculated to impress British public opinion. It was meant to galvanise Asquith into granting Home Rule and putting Home Rule on the statute book. And this paid off, because on the 18th of September, the Home Rule Bill received the royal assent and went on the statute book. So you now had the legal achievement of devolution. And there was wild enthusiasm in Britain and in Ireland for this achievement. The goal that Parnell had set himself back in the 1880s had at last been achieved. Ireland had got Home Rule. But of course, the Home Rule Act of September 1914 was accompanied by a suspending act which suspended the introduction of Home Rule until the war was ended. So in other words, Home Rule was not actually put into operation. And along with that, there was a clause dealing with the exclusion of Ulster that stated the employment of force, any kind of force, for the coercion of Ulster is an absolutely unthinkable thing. So therefore, Ulster could not be forced into a Home Rule Parliament. And so in a sense, therefore, the whole Home Rule Act of 1914 was essentially a fiction. It maintained the political fiction that Ireland could be treated as a single political entity, when the reality was, of course, that was not the case. And so much of what the Irish Parliamentary Party seemed to have won in 1914 was actually a mirage. It appeared to have achieved its goal, but in actual fact it had very little power, it had no power. There was no Parliament at Dublin, and there was no semblance of authority really to cover the position in which the Irish Parliamentary Party found itself. At the outbreak of war, most people in Ireland, regardless of their political affiliation, reacted the same way as most people in Britain, that they thought the war was a just war, that it was a necessary evil, that here was Britain and the United Kingdom going to war against unprovoked German aggression, that this war was going to be fought for small nations, for the defence of brave little Belgium, that the Germans were doing unspeakable things to civilians in Britain, in Belgium and in France. There was also, of course, the belief that the war was going to be very short. The war was going to be over by Christmas. And Ireland's part of it would be a brief part, and then Ireland, well, once the war was over, Ireland would get Home Rule. And when Redmond offered the Irish National Volunteers for the defence of Ireland, that was about as far as most Irish nationalists were prepared to go, that the volunteers would stay in Ireland and defend Ireland against a possible German attack. But Redmond went further than this. The Home Rule Act came into operation on the 18th of September 1914. 2 days later, on the 20th of September 1914, Redmond went further, and he urged his followers to join the British Army. And he called on the volunteers, quote, to serve not only in Ireland itself, but wherever the firing line extends, in defence of right, of freedom, and of religion. Redmond believed that this show of loyalty, unconditional loyalty to Britain, would render the implementation of Home Rule inevitable. And he also believed that by fighting on a common battlefield, that the war experience would blend Ulster Protestants and Irish nationalists together. This sort of the reconciling power, if you like, of common war service. And Redmond also, of course, believed in the British Empire. I mean, Redmond believed that an Ireland that was self-governing could take its place amongst the other autonomous nations like Canada and New Zealand and Australia, etc. But Redmond did not want to sever the Irish connection with Britain and the Crown. But of course this creates a split in the Irish Volunteers. And as I'm sure you know, the majority of the volunteers, they become the National Volunteers, they stay with Redmond. Those people who opposed to what Redmond had committed, the volunteers, they broke away, they kept the name of the Irish Volunteers. They numbered about 11 or 12,000, and this was the group that was led by Patrick Pearse and Owen McNeill and Thomas MacDonald. McNeill states, "The Irish Volunteers were pledged to the cause of Ireland, of all Ireland, of Ireland only, and was not there to serve the imperial government in defence of the British Empire," which of course was the opposite of what Redmond had wanted. And Tom Kettle, who had actually been a member of the Irish Volunteers and had gone to Germany to buy weapons for the Irish Volunteers. He was a professor of economics at UCD. I mean, he joined the Royal Dublin Fusiliers, and he writes in one of his books, "Used with the wisdom that is sown in tears and blood, this tragedy of Europe may be, and must be, the prologue of the two reconciliations which all statesmen have dreamed, the reconciliation of Protestant Ulster with Ireland, and the reconciliation of Ireland with Great Britain." So Kettle comes back to this idea that Redmond had, you know, by serving together, this common service would help overcome the divisions that existed in Ireland. The Ulster reaction, of course, is completely different. Carson almost immediately promises the British government unionist support for the war. And he urges the Ulster Volunteer Force, this paramilitary force that had been set up just a year earlier, to enlist. And they were allowed to do so by the British government. They were allowed to set up their own division with their own officers and with their own symbols. And of course, the 36th Ulster Division was closely and inextricably associated with Ulster Protestantism. And this was to be, the 36th Ulster Division would be the symbol of Protestant Ulster's commitment to king and country and to empire. Carson was to say in one of his speeches, "England's difficulty is not Ulster's opportunity. England's difficulty is our difficulty." As opposed, of course, to the old nationalist slogan, which was, "England's difficulty is Ireland's opportunity." And later on there was a poem in one of the Belfast newspapers, of "Wherever the fight is hottest and the sorest task is set, Ulster will strike for England, and England will not forget. England will not forget what we are doing." So there's a sort of a paradox here as well, by the way. I mean, a few months earlier, the Ulster Unionists had been threatening to go to war with Britain if Home Rule was actually passed. And here you have the paradox now, or here the Ulster Unionists swearing their allegiance to the British cause. There was also, by the way, a debt of honour, and that which Ulster Unionists felt, and that was the debt of honour towards the army, the British Army in Ireland, whose officers had said they would rather resign rather than impose Home Rule upon Ireland. An Ulster Unionist businessman wrote to Carson at the time, and he says, "The army stood by us in our darkest hour, and now we must stand with them and with the empire." Redmond had campaigned that the Irish Volunteers be allowed to do the same thing, be allowed to set up their own separate Irish division. But the British government, and certainly the War Office, were very reluctant to have a division made up entirely of the Irish Volunteers. It would almost become like an Irish National Army. So in actual fact what happened was two divisions were set up, the 16th Irish and the 10th Irish Division, and they were officered for the most part by British officers as opposed to being officered by Irish officers, which of course the Ulster Unionists had been allowed to do with the 36th Ulster Division. Both camps therefore expected gratitude from the British government. You know, the Ulster Unionists expected the British government would therefore support them in their fight against the granting of Home Rule. Redmond, the Irish Volunteers, expected that the British government would show their gratitude by granting Home Rule at the end of the war. So they were both expecting and hoping for very different goals. What neither of them really had counted for was the fact that the British government was not going to take Irish interests as its priority. Irish interests were going to become very much secondary, indeed tertiary. That it was the interests of the British government and fighting the war that was going to take priority over any Irish interests. And this is what happens as the years pass. Next one. Yeah. So, in the early stages of the war, nationalist Ireland had been fairly enthusiastic about the cause, the Allied cause. But of course, gradually as the war goes on and the casualties mount up, that enthusiasm begins to diminish. The 10th Irish Division, for example, suffered very heavily in the Gallipoli campaign. And Redmond's position was eroded even more when in May 1915, Asquith formed a coalition government with the Conservative Unionist Party. And certainly John Dillon, who was the leader of one of the leaders of the Irish Parliamentary Party at the time, he felt from this point on that the Irish Party steadily lost its hold on the people because they now had a much weaker bargaining position. In the coalition government, all the adversaries of Redmond on Home Rule were brought into the British cabinet. All the people who had spent their political lives fighting against Home Rule were now brought into the government. People like Lord Balfour, Lord Lansdowne, Walter Long, Bonar Law. And most sickening of all, perhaps, was the fact that Carson, who a very short time earlier had been threatening rebellion against the British government, he was now, and the leader of the Ulster Unionists, he was now brought into the British coalition government as Attorney General. The fact that he had previously been threatening treason seemed to be no obstacle to his elevation to a cabinet post. The Bishop of Killaloe, who was a very staunch supporter of the Irish Parliamentary Party, wrote at the time, "Home Rule is dead and buried. Ireland is without a national party. What the future has in store for us, God knows. I suppose conscription, with a bloody feud between people and soldiers." So the Liberal government was now dead. The Liberal government which had promised Home Rule was now defunct. And the big question was really whether the Liberals would ever again be in a position to deliver this Home Rule promise. And certainly the prospect of Home Rule coming into operation seemed very remote. Redmond was invited to join this coalition government, but he refused because Redmond felt that that would be the final act in his demise if he were to go along and join a coalition government with members of the Conservative opposition and with a coalition government that included Carson. So what happens then over the next few years is that the government really is indifferent to Ireland. Lloyd George and the coalition government, their main objective, their key objective, their sole objective was to win the war and to defeat Germany. And so they never have the time, they don't have the time, they don't have the inclination, they don't have the desire to do anything about Ireland. So there's no real coherent Irish policy. And what this does do, of course, it gives the advanced nationalists, those who want to break the link with Britain, it gives them an opportunity. They do see England's opportunity, England's difficulty, sorry, as Ireland's opportunity. The international situation has now created a vacuum in which they can move. The last time that was to happen, really, the last time an international position had arisen like that, you have to go back really to the Napoleonic times and to the French Revolutionary Wars, 1796, 1798, at the time of Wolfe Tone and the United Irishmen, when eventually they tried to use the international situation there to rise up in rebellion with French support. And so, it's then that it's in the end of 1914, beginning of 1915, that Pearse and MacDonagh and James Connolly and the leaders of the Irish Republican Brotherhood and the Irish Citizen Army, they decide that they would embark upon a revolution, that this provides the opportunity. And German support was absolutely vital for this. Joseph Plunkett and Roger Casement went to Germany to try and get support from the German government for a rebellion, because the Germans had already given arms just a few years earlier to the Ulster Unionists and to the Ulster Volunteers. But the German reaction is very limited. The Germans really don't feel that the IRB are sufficiently organised to mount a sustained rebellion against the British government. So the German support is very limited. The Germans, as most of you probably know, they sent a small ship with some arms over to Ireland, and of course it was eventually found and it was scuttled, and the arms don't land. And at that point, really, any chance that the insurrection at Easter was to have of succeeding had gone. And now the only thing left really was the blood sacrifice, which Pearse talked about, and this, of course, takes place. So the rising, which was postponed for a day because of the fact that the arms don't land, the rising takes place in 1916, and I'm not going to go into the details of that. But
that's a good start.
One of the things that happens during the rising, of course, is that in Pearse's proclamation, Pearse talks about and he refers to gallant allies in Europe, and here, of course, he is referring to Germany. And the reaction to the rising in Ireland is very mixed. Certainly, there were many people who objected to it, and when the rising eventually is crushed and the insurgents are led away, it is true that many women did come and hurl abuse at them. Many of these were in fact dependents of the Irish soldiers who were serving in the British Army, and they saw this as a stab in the back, and many of them were unable to get their allowances, the allowances that they got because their husbands were in the army. As a result of that, there was resentment at the destruction and the loss of life that had taken place in Dublin in particular during the Easter Rising. And many civilians did lose their lives. Some of you may have read Sebastian Barry's book on this. If you haven't, it's a wonderful book called A Long, Long Way, about a young Irishman who was serving in the British Army and returns to Dublin on leave. And he is in Dublin when the rising takes place, and the confusion in his own mind when he sees soldiers in the uniform that he wears having to fire upon his own fellow countrymen. I don't know if have any of you read that, A Long, Long Way, Sebastian Barry? He writes beautifully. However, the government's reaction to this reflected the wartime circumstances. The British government saw this as a stab in the back. This was treason. And they appoint a general as they impose martial law, they appoint General Maxwell as the military governor, and he reacts as a soldier. Here was treason. This was armed rebellion against the king and against the nation and against the empire. And so the executions are ordered. There are 90 death sentences that are passed, and eventually, of course, the 16 or the 15 men, and Casement a little later, are executed over a period of 10 days. And so you have, the birth of what Yeats referred to as the terrible beauty. And in one way, some people have argued, had Pearse not made it so obvious that there was this German link, that maybe the British government might have reacted differently. But because that German link was there and Britain was fighting against Germany, therefore this was an act of treason and this had to be the British government couldn't allow this. This had to be cracked down again with the utmost severity. But of course, in Ireland, it changes so much that there were many people in Ireland who did not approve of the methods which the insurgents had used, but certainly many people in Ireland approved of their aims. And when the executions take place, it does gradually change the mood of many people in Ireland. Francis Ledwidge, who was one of the National Volunteers and a poet, he died at the Third Battle of Ypres, Passchendaele, 1917. He exemplifies the way Irish nationalist sentiment changed towards the war, towards 1916, when he said, "I joined the British Army because she stood between Ireland and an enemy of civilization, and I would not have her say that she defended us while we did nothing but pass resolutions." However, he was in Dublin in 1916 on military leave, and he saw what had happened with the executions, and he said that later, "If someone were to tell me now that the Germans were coming over our back wall, I wouldn't lift a finger to stop them. They could come." And Tom Kettle, whom I quoted earlier to you, who had joined the British Army, and indeed he was later to die at the Somme, he said, the rising was a terrible experience. I have no sympathy with it, but, he says, he anticipated really how posterity would view him and other people like him with the 1916 leaders. He says, "These men will go down in history as heroes and martyrs. I will go down, if I go down at all, as a bloody British officer." And he wrote that in 1916, shortly before he was killed. John Dillon, who was one of the two main leaders of the Irish Parliamentary Party, he wrote, "It is not murderers who are being executed." He said this in the House of Commons, actually. He didn't write it, this is a speech in the House of Commons. "It is not murderers who are being executed. It is insurgents who have fought a clean fight, a brave fight, however misguided. And it would be a damn good thing for you if your soldiers were able to put up as good a fight as did those men in Dublin. 3,000 men against 20,000 with machine guns and artillery." And so what happens then after 1916 is that with the executions, with the imposition of martial law in Ireland, with the arrest of many, many nationalists, not only the insurgents, of course, who had taken place, but many sympathisers, the closing down of newspapers, the thousands of house searches which took place in Ireland, and they, as they proved in the Troubles as well, really could turn public opinion very much against. The lack of Home Rule and any prospect of Home Rule, and the fact that there was a coalition government with the Conservatives in that government, all combined really to break the Irish Parliamentary Party's dominance of Irish politics. And it helped all these actions, the British government's actions post-1916, reinforced the traditional image of the Anglo-Irish relationship as one between Britain, the oppressor, and Ireland, the oppressed. And the one group that was going to gain most advantage from that was, of course, those people who favoured separatism from Britain, namely the revolutionaries and Sinn Féin. Even though, of course, it wasn't the Sinn Féin rising, Sinn Féin hadn't been involved in it. For the Ulster Unionists, however, this rising of 1916 was simply evidence of the perfidy of Irish Catholics, Irish nationalists. This was the stab in the back. That, if anything symbolises for Ulster Unionists their loyalty, it was what happened on the first day of the Battle of the Somme on the 1st of July 1916. Coming so soon after the Easter Rising, that was a stark contrast. On the 1st of July 1916, the 36th Ulster Division attacked the German lines over a 15-mile front. And over the next 2 days, out of 15,000 men, they suffered 5,500 casualties, either dead, wounded, or missing. Over a third of the 36th Ulster Division. It was their first major engagement in the war. These were enormous casualties. And it had an enormous effect on the small towns and villages in Ulster and on the streets in Belfast. Because the 36th Ulster Division, they exemplified in many ways the PALS divisions that were formed at the very beginning of the war, when groups of people who were friends or who came from the same area came together and formed these PALS divisions. It seemed a good idea at the beginning of the war because it helped to get people to recruit if you all went along with your mates and you all signed up at roughly the same time and from the same village or the same town or the same area or indeed the same profession or the same trade. But of course the British government soon stopped this because when the PALS regiments went into action and then you had, say they came from a particular area, there were the Accrington PALS, and then suffered horrendous casualties, then that had a huge effect on the small town or village where these people were living. But the 36th Ulster Division very much resembled that. And because Ulster Protestantism, there was an enclosed community, a very tight, closely knit community. And for many Ulstermen, of course, it was a particularly poignant date because it was the actual date of the Battle of the Boyne in 1690. According to the old defunct Julian calendar, and certainly it is true that some soldiers went over wearing orange sashes, and some of them were shouting "No surrender." What happens, however, is the story of this battle becomes stitched permanently into the Ulster Protestant loyalist tradition. Carson said Ulstermen had made the supreme sacrifice for the empire, of which they were so proud, and so this was their commitment to king, country, and empire. And of course it contrasted completely to the treachery of the Irish, which the Irish nationalists had revealed during the 1916 Rising. And so what happens really is the gulf between the Irish nationalists and the Ulster Protestants, the Ulster loyalists, grows even wider. I mean, Redmond's hope that the war would somehow bring this common war service, would bring them together, in fact, never appeared. Over the next couple of years, from 1916 to 1918, there was a growing disillusionment with the war. There was growing disillusionment with the war in Britain and certainly in Ireland. And Redmond's position continues to decline, whereas the position of Sinn Féin, who played no part in the 1916 Rising, but the support for Sinn Féin continues to grow. And the British government's repressive policy assists Sinn Féin in winning a series of electoral victories. In 1917, for example, De Valera stood in East Clare, which was the constituency which had been held by Willie Redmond. Willie Redmond, who was John Redmond's brother, had been killed in France, and here you had De Valera then coming and winning that seat from the Irish Parliamentary Party. And so advanced nationalism, revolutionary nationalism, was replacing constitutional nationalism. And really what had happened during this war, the First World War, the European empires, the great empires that I mentioned at the very beginning of this talk, the great empires had gone to war to maintain the status quo, to maintain the ancien regime, if you like. But as the war continued, it had really turned into a people's war, a massive people's war. And the war released political, economic, social forces, which really overturned not just Ireland, but overturned much of the world as well. And I'll just show the final slide here. What also changes in 1917 is it sees the entry of America into the war in April 1917. And the Americans hadn't entered the war to save the British Empire or the French Empire at all. President Wilson and the Americans had not done so. Wilson had an idea that he and the Americans would come and help create a new and a better world out of the old European world, which seems to be disappearing. In one of his 14 points, these were the 14 objectives that Wilson had given to the American people for entering into this European war. He enunciated the principle of self-determination along the lines of nationality and the rights of small nations. And that, of course, gave Sinn Féin tremendous encouragement. They had hopes, the Sinn Féin leaders had hoped that when the war was over, that Ireland's case for being a small nation requiring self-determination would be met. And of course, there were many, many Irish who had gone to America. There was an important Irish lobby in America, and Sinn Féin hoped that they would go and be able to use that Irish-American lobby to put pressure on Wilson. And of course, when the war ends, De Valera does go to America. De Valera spends something like 18 months in America getting Irish-American support and of course Irish-American money. The British government's indifference to Ireland is reflected in the conscription crisis of 1918. In March 1918, the Germans launched a major offensive on the Western Front. And the British Army was thrown back with huge losses. The Germans penetrated 4.5 miles in the space of a couple of days. One of the most extensive advances that has been made by any army during the First World War. British casualties on the 21st of March 1918, British casualties were 38,500. Over the next 5 weeks, they suffered 300,000 casualties. So there was a desperate need in March 1918 for more men. And of course, conscription had been introduced in Britain in 1916. The age limit was 18 to 41. And now the British government decides that they're going to change that conscription age. They change it from 18 to 17, and they move it from 41 to 51, because the military need is overwhelming. And there was great pressure, of course, on the British government to say, but here in Ireland, there's a good source of men as well. And so they introduced this act which enables them to introduce conscription into Ireland. And this provokes a huge reaction in Ireland. Everyone in Ireland of a nationalist Catholic identity revolts against this. The Irish Parliamentary Party, John Dillon, and Joe Devlin, De Valera, Arthur Griffith of Sinn Féin, the Labour Party, all the bishops of the Catholic Church come out against the British government's attempt to introduce conscription. John Dillon, is so enraged by this that in April 1916 he leads the Irish Parliamentary Party out of the House of Commons to say that they will not participate in this because of this threat to introduce conscription into Ireland. And so it really devastates, the Irish Parliamentary Party's credibility, because what the Irish Parliamentary Party are now doing by walking out of Westminster is they're actually adopting, of course, the Sinn Féin policy, which is one of abstentionism from Westminster, which they had always proclaimed. Dillon was to say, no man in Ireland, no matter what party he belongs to, believes in or places any reliance whatsoever on promises or pledges of British statesmen. He accused Lloyd George of deliberately adopting a policy of destroying the constitutional party and throwing the country into the hands of a revolutionary party. Lloyd George didn't do this deliberately to upset people, but Lloyd George did it because he wanted to make sure that Britain won the war, and if there was going to be people in Ireland that could go and replace those people who had suffered casualties in France, then he was going to use them. Joe Devlin, who was one of the leaders of the Irish Parliamentary Party, he said, "What guarantee have we when the war is over, when the fields of Europe are red with Irish blood, that your declaration of devotion to small nations is anything more than a scrap of paper? We believe it is a war for small nations in every part of Europe, except that small nation which you control." Now, this was a constitutional nationalist saying this. Eventually, of course, due to the uproar in Ireland and due to the fact that there was going to be armed resistance to this, conscription was dropped and conscription was never actually introduced into Ireland. This made it even worse, in a sense even more stupid, to have actually tried to introduce conscription and then decided not to do it. So they gained all the opprobrium for having tried to do it and gained none of the advantages by having actually more men. But what it does do, it sort of breaks the Irish Parliamentary Party's influence irreparably. And it's the final proof, by the way, to many unionists who had joined up of nationalist disloyalty. And it proves to unionists that Irish nationalists, together with the Catholic Church, had combined together to attempt to thwart the authority of the Parliament. at Westminster. So the war ends then and just coming to a conclusion here, the war ends in 1918 and an election is held almost immediately both in Britain and in Ireland. And at that election, of course, Sinn Féin win a spectacular victory. Sinn Féin, who had no seats at all in 1914, end up in 1918 with 73 seats. The Irish Parliamentary Party, which had dominated Irish politics since the time of Parnell, are reduced to a mere 6. Sinn Féin now speak for the vast majority of people in Ireland. Lord George wins. Lord George's coalition government win the election in 1918, but they win 470 seats out of 707, so it's a huge majority for Lord George's coalition. But of that coalition, 335 are Conservative Unionists, 133 are coalition Liberals. So even though Lord George is a Liberal, he's the Prime Minister, it's very much a Conservative-dominated coalition government, and so it remains. And so effectively the Conservatives have a stranglehold on Lord George's Irish policy. And therefore it was absolutely inevitable there that Lloyd George is going to have to give way on the whole question of partition, and that the government's Irish policy is going to be determined by the Conservatives within that coalition government. And so it was. I mean, obviously what happens after 1918 is it takes you on then to the whole Anglo-Irish War and the Troubles and eventually the Treaty of 1921. But what I would argue is that the whole question of partition was certainly there and was inevitable. That there was no way the British government was going to grant an all-Irish Parliament, not just in 1921, but in my analysis well before 1921. Just to conclude, as I see it's a few minutes after 8, just looking at commemoration in Ireland. In Britain, the Great War, as it was called, it wasn't really called the First World War until much later. The Great War really helped to bind British people together. In Ireland, it didn't. The Great War was a subject of controversy, of bitter debate, of division. It exacerbates the divisions between Unionists and Nationalists. It exacerbates the divisions between Constitutional Nationalists and Republicans. And these divisions actually continued in many ways after the Great War, certainly in commemoration. Those Irishmen who fought in the British Army and who returned to Ireland were not officially recognised for many, many years. I mean, there was a virtual ban in Ireland on commemoration of the Irish war dead. There were remembrance services held in Dublin and College Green, actually in central Dublin, but very often they ended up in violence with clashes between nationalists and unionists and clashes between nationalists and ex-servicemen. And it wasn't until 1927 the Irish government agreed to the construction of a war memorial in Dublin. But this was put outside the city in Island Bridge rather than in Merrion Square in the centre of Dublin, which had been originally proposed. And in the 1920s, Kevin O'Higgins, who was the Vice President to Cosgrave, and he had two brothers in the British Army, one of which was killed. Kevin O'Higgins said in a dull debate, "No one denies the sacrifice and patriotic motives which induced the vast majority of these men to join the British Army. And yet, it's not on their sacrifice that this state is based. This state has other origins." And the Memorial Park wasn't eventually opened until 1948 in Dublin, and was still actually incomplete. The first time that the Irish state had an official dedication to commemorate the dead of the First World War was actually in 2006, in July 2006, when Mary McAleese, who was then President, and Bertie Ahern, who was then Taoiseach, came together to mark the 90th anniversary of the Battle of the Somme in Dublin. In Northern Ireland, however, the commemoration was very different. This was, in Northern Ireland, commemorations of the dead of the First World War gave Ulster Protestants a chance to affirm their loyalty to the British link and Ulster's Protestant heritage. And that's why commemoration of the First World War in Northern Ireland was almost exclusively a Protestant affair. Even though as many Northern Catholics had actually joined the British Army during these 4 years as Protestants had. And when the Belfast Cenotaph, which is there just in front of the City Hall, Belfast, was unveiled on the 11th of November 1928, the veterans from the 16th Irish Division, which included many Belfast Catholics from West Belfast, from the Falls Road and Springfield Road in that area, were not even invited to that. And in Northern Ireland, many Somme Orange Lodges were formed. And on the 1st of July, there are many orange marches to commemorate the first day of the Somme in 1916. One of the most controversial of these, of course, which some of you may know about, is the famous march to Drumcree Church, which caused so much difficulties about 20 years ago. And that was not a march, that's not a march that commemorated the Battle of the Boyne. That was a march to commemorate the Ulster, 36 Ulster Division's casualties at the Somme on the 1st of July. And that's why, of course, many Orangemen said, you know, this is a religious service, it's not a sectarian service. But of course, they had to walk down the Garvaghey Road, and many Catholics, of course, objected to the Orange Lodge marching down the Garvaghey Road. Just to conclude, I mean, what does happen is that in the last 10 years, and certainly since the peace process, and as Anglo-Irish relations have improved, there's a new Irish engagement, and there has been a new Irish engagement with the Great War and its commemoration. I mean, there's a fresh interest in the war. And it's best exemplified on the 11th of November 1998, when a new Irish War Memorial was inaugurated at Messines Ridge in Belgium by the Queen Elizabeth II, Mary Magdalene, and the King of Belgium, Albert II. This was the Irish Peace Tower, which some of you may have seen or been to. The Island of Ireland Peace Tower, and it's on Messines Ridge, where one of the few times where the two Irish divisions did actually fight together in 1917, the 36th Ulster Division and the 16th Irish Division. And that, I think, ceremony there was a ceremony of reconciliation. You know, it was a public acknowledgement of the two traditions of the men who had fought in the First World War. And so Redmond's, you know, dream of the power of a shared war experience bringing friendship and reconciliation, well, that was never realised in the years 1914 to 1918. But certainly I think there's hope now that with this new spirit, the new attitude of the past, that some of the wounds, and particularly some of the wounds that have been created by the Troubles, that the Great War might be seen now as a source of understanding and of dialogue between the two traditions in Ireland. And that's, I think, I've run slightly over my time.
Helena Beerin and Gary Cowan, they're the people who are in it. I'm sure most of you have heard it if you haven't seen it. Okay? That's what the... Right. St Mary's University is holding an Irish Studies Symposium on a Saturday in June to be confirmed. St Mary's are using this event to promote their Irish Studies MA to commence in September by publishing it with Irish community groups and organisations. 3 of their lectures will speak on selected Irish study topics. That's an interesting one. That will be here. Hopefully I'll do that. The Irish Ambassador Daniel Hall will present a W.B. Yeats poetry evening. We haven't said that yet. He's doing a few of them and he'll let us know when. Irish academic Bronwyn Walter will present a seminar about Irish identities by gender. And again, we wait for further information on all of those. That is about the notices, unless I've forgotten anything. But I'll now put you back to Jen. There'll be a question and answer session. I'd ask everybody to just ask one question. If there's time, we'll come back and we'll take another one. And not to be too long, so as we can give everybody a chance to get a question in. Thank you. Can we ask the first question, please?
There we are. Just a very, very quick one based on some of the things that you've said.
Can you
about
identify
past.
yourself, please?
Sorry?
Can you tell me who you are?
Oh, no, I don't want anybody to know.
You're ready to go.
John Hutchison, Luton Irish Forum. Okay. Very, very quick one. Something we've touched on before, but I'll touch upon it again in light of the new information that I've gleaned tonight. Obviously, not only were there conflicts between the nationalists, if you like, Catholic nationalists and Unionist Protestants, whatever you want to put it, but the fact remains is that there are also deep divisions within communities as a result of bitterness that was created by those people, like my grandfather who fought in the 1418 war, and his children, who would have been very much of a younger generation, who in later life would have been promoting the concept that we had been failed by the lack of the Home Rule as a result of Redmond not being able to deliver. So for years and years, people like my grandfather would have been ostracised by the community, by even within his own family, although he didn't take any prisoners himself, let me tell you. So at the end of the day, I know that there was rumours that there was a rising in Germany at the time when the word percolated through that there had been a rising in Dublin, and a lot of the Irish soldiers laid down their guns and said they wouldn't fight until the propagandists got to work and said, no, these are all German lies. There is no rising in Dublin. Carry on fighting, so they picked up their guns and carried on fighting. But more concern to me is that it's only recently that the Irish who fought in Germany at that time have been recognised by the Irish government and given the status that they deserve, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Thank you, John. Would you like to?
Yeah, no, I mean, I accept what you're saying. It is only recently, I mean, as I mentioned in my talk, it was in 1998 that the Irish government gave the first official dedication, and that was the meeting between Bertie Ahern and Denise when the monument was unveiled, and that was the 90th anniversary of the Battle of the Somme. That was a very long time. That was the first official dedication by the Irish government, even though there had been the Memorial Park that had been opened in 1948, but there hadn't been an official dedication of that. So I accept what you're saying. I don't know, I've never heard of any instance where Irish soldiers refused to obey orders during the First World War. There were certainly mutinies in the French army, particularly after Verdun, but I don't know any...
What about the Connacht Rangers?
No, hold on, the Connacht Rangers afterwards.
Oh yeah.
The Connacht Rangers afterwards. I don't know any examples during 1914 and 18 of any Irish regiments, or indeed even of individual soldiers who refused to fight. Because if you refused to fight, you were under the possibility of being executed, a death sentence. There was certainly confusion, and there were numerous letters of people writing home and saying, "Is this true? And what is happening? And is there a rising? And are the British soldiers firing on Irishmen and killing Irishmen?" There are certainly examples of that. The only example I know of a mutiny is the one that you mentioned, and that was the Connacht Rangers. But that was in 1921, and that was the Connacht Rangers in India, when they did mutiny for a while. And indeed one of them was, 6 of them I think received the death sentence, and 5 of them were commuted, and one was executed. Actually, it was a man from Roscommon, from my mother's county, and he's buried actually still in India. I think there's an attempt to bring his body back to Roscommon. But that's the only instance I know of any mutiny by Irish soldiers in the army.
Can I ask, what recognition?
Just a minute, Jerry. Can I ask you to put the next question, please?
All right. What recognition should Irishmen who fought in the British Army, what should they get? They were uniformed, they were paid, they were trained, they were armed by the British government for their own uses.
Yeah.
So they did it for money. Because I had an uncle in the Second World War, and I had a granduncle in the First World War. Now, this British admiral came down the south coast and along the west coast, and all the fishing villages and small towns, and the Irish were morphed from being the scum of the earth to the salt of the earth, and of course they flocked into the British Navy. So my great-grand-uncle, he joined, he was on the HMS Tiger. He must have been a deckhand because they were in a battle and they were shrapnel flying off, men were being killed, and as they fall, their comrades would go up and rifle their pockets. Next thing, they'd be down. He sat in a corner where some were safe, covered himself up, and he prayed to God that if he survived, he'd build a church in Thanksgiving. So after the war, he emigrated to Canada, and up in British Columbia in the Rockies, he built a church up there. But the point is, the Irish were fools to do things like that.
Well, I don't agree with you that they did it for money.
Yeah.
Now, there were many motives why people joined the British Army. Undoubtedly, some people did who were unemployed and who were trying to raise a family, and at least joining the army gave a salary. If they survived it, it gave a pension. It gave family allowances, and it gave, if they were killed, it gave widows' allowances. So undoubtedly some people were in such dire economic situation that they did join for money. But there were many others who joined out of reasons of patriotism, out of a belief in the cause, out of a belief of saving Germany. There were many of the Irish volunteers who were Redmond's people, National Volunteers who were Redmond's people. They went because Redmond told them that this was for the cause. This was for the cause of Ireland. I think that there are a myriad of reasons, I think, why people joined the army in 1914, 1918, and I think it would be wrong to say they joined for money. There were too many motives by people. Other people joined because their mate had joined, because their brother had joined, because people in their local village were joining. So I wouldn't accept your analysis that they did it for money.
Very briefly, please.
Very briefly. The soldiers who attacked the 16 Rising came from the Curragh, and they were largely Irish. So the first people that the Republicans fought against was their own people.
Yeah, I would accept that. Yeah.
So these people, soldiers are not men, they're dogs. Like a dog, you tell them what to do and it does it. They have no choice.
But that's the whole point of being in an army. You do what you're told to do. And when you join the army, you accept that.
Not in revolutionary armies, you do it because you
Okay, Darren, thanks for the question. And can we move on, please? And can I ask another person to put a question?
Hi, it's Martin, Luton Irish. Thanks for the seminars, really enjoyed it. I just wanted to ask, something jumped out at me, the point about the 10th and 11th Brigades of the Irish Volunteers.
10th and 16th, yeah.
10th and 16th,
yeah.
sorry.
Yes,
and you mentioned about them being sent over to Gallipoli.
yeah.
And I was just wondering, is there any evidence, any history that's shown that perhaps the nationalist brigades were strategically placed in any way to inflict maximum casualties, to preempt or suppress the nationalist cause?
There isn't really, no. I mean, the Gallipoli campaign was in 1915. The Rising wasn't until 1916. And there's no evidence, certainly, that I came across that that Irish divisions were put in a more threatening or a more dangerous situation than any other divisions in the British Army. I don't think there's any real evidence of that. Although, just on that point, I go to Brittany quite a lot in the west of France. I go there every year, and certainly in Brittany there is some evidence that the French generals put Breton battalions in the front line much more frequently than any other single region of France, and the Bretons suffered much more heavily than any other single region in France. And there was a feeling, certainly it still is a feeling in Brittany that they were sacrificed on that basis. But there's no evidence that I ever came across that ever happened to the Irish divisions.
Thank
you. Can I go for another question, please? This lady down here.
Yeah, my name's Anne Kelly. I just wanted to say on the Gallipoli topic, obviously it's a centenary this year, and the government's having a special service at the Cenotaph on Anzac Day, 25th of April, and they're inviting descendants of the men that fought at Gallipoli to attend this special service. So if anyone's a descendant of anybody who was there, if they go onto the government website www.gov.uk, it will give you the information of how to apply for tickets.
I'd be very surprised if there weren't invitations sent out as well to representatives of the Irish government, because it was the 10th Division, Irish Division, that suffered very heavily at Gallipoli as well as the Anzacs. Yeah.
Thanks. This lady here.
Kathleen Dodd. Were there any Catholics in the 36th Ulster Regiment? Would they have been there?
That's a good question. There may have been, but if there were very few, because any Catholic, I mean, I come from Belfast myself, and I certainly know I had friends of mine whose grandfathers joined the British Army, but they nearly all joined the 16th Irish Division. All those Catholics from the West Belfast and from Ardoyne actually as well. I never came across anybody, and I never heard of anybody who was a Catholic who had joined the. I mean, you see, given the political situation at the time, if you were a Catholic and you were joining the British Army, you know, why would you want to join the 36th Ulster Protestant Division? You know? Would have been a rare sort of Catholic to do that. Although it may have happened, but I don't know. Yeah.
Thanks for the question. Paddy.
Good question. Good Irish one. I don't know how to put this question really to you, but you talked there about the recent commemorations, about the Ulster Volunteers and the other divisions that came from West Belfast. Did they come together and as a group and celebrate, you know, the 1914-18 war? My father fought in the Somme, you know,
Yeah.
at the time.
Do you mean did the descendants come together?
Yes, or those who are still alive, really, you know.
But there's nobody still alive.
Nobody still alive. No, sorry about that.
No, from the First World War.
From the First World
No,
War.
the last survivor of the First World War died about. He was called Harry. Harry Hatch. That's right. He died about a year ago. Did any of them come together? Well, of course, see the
Before that.
Yeah, but before that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, of course, the commemorations were very muted. I mean, in the south of Ireland, after 1921, there were very few commemorations held, and they tended to be almost exclusively ex-servicemen and their families in the south of Ireland. In the north of Ireland, I think, as I mentioned, the commemoration ceremonies, certainly in the 1920s and 30s and up to the beginning of the Second World War, were almost exclusively all Protestant ceremonies. You know, I mean, I think, as I mentioned, when the Cenotaph was opened in Belfast in 1924, no one was invited from the 16th Ulster Division, the 16th Irish Division, to attend that.
But even after that, no.
After the Second World War?
No, even after the First World War.
After the First World War.
No commemoration whatsoever.
Well, not coming together in the sense that you're talking about. Yeah. No.
Okay.
Teresa, would you like to ask a question? No. Okay, sorry. Anybody else? No, I need another question.
Jim, I'm just wondering what your view is on the forthcoming memorials and celebrations that we're going to be going through in the next few years. Do you have a view on whether there could be divisiveness involved?
Yeah, I mean, the whole question of commemoration and memory and celebration it's a very difficult one. I mean, you know, as I mentioned in the south of Ireland, commemoration was very muted, and indeed many soldiers who had fought in the First World, many Irish soldiers who fought in the First World War in the south of Ireland were very quiet about it, and indeed almost ashamed about it, as were their families. And of course, it was exacerbated. I mean, had the war ended in 1918, that was the end of it, okay. But what happens, of course, is you've got 1919, you've got the Troubles, you've got the War of Independence, you've got the fight against the British Army and the RIC and the Black and Tans and all the rest of it, and this exacerbates the whole thing. I mean, it's the fight against Britain, and here were men who had been fighting for Britain between 14 and 18. So that exacerbates the whole thing of commemoration, and then of course you have the Civil War as well. So I mean, the memories were very deep there, and I can understand why many people did not want to be seen at commemorative ceremonies in the south of Ireland during the 1920s and the 1930s, and certainly they were divisive. Yeah, they were. And some of the, if you read of some of the diaries and some of the speeches of some of the leading politicians at the time, they don't want to know about it. Okay, there's going to be this memorial in Dublin, but they don't want to get involved in it. Right? We're putting it up, but you look after it. And we shy away from it. But if you look at what's happened in the last few years, I mean, certainly there's much greater interest now in the First World War, particularly, of course, with the centenary last year, and with the peace process in Northern Ireland, and with the genuine attempt, I think, by people of both traditions in Ireland to try and understand each other a little bit better. In that sense, I think it has been healing, yeah. And the fact that you now had this Irish peace tower that was built by young people from north of Ireland and the south of Ireland who came together and built this round tower. And the two politicians who were behind it, one of them was Paddy Hart, who was a Fine Gael TD, and the other one was a guy called Glenn Barr, who had been an Ulster loyalist involved in the whole, back in the early days of the Troubles. I mean, they were two of the key figures behind this Irish Round Tower. So in that sense, there has been a coming together. Of course, it's very interesting. I mean, your question is very good about what's going to happen with the celebrations of the Easter Rising next year in 2016, and how is that going to be celebrated, and who is going to be there. And of course, the Irish government has intimated that they would be happy to see certainly representatives from the British government, and they also made reference to representatives of the British monarchy being there. You know, and there's talk of Prince Charles, maybe, being at the GPO in Dublin in 1916. Now, some people would say that as a red rag to the bull. Other people would say, well, why not? It was 100 years ago, and you know, given the fact that we're now trying to understand each other better, it's going to be a very difficult one. I mean, a committee has been set up to commemorate, to draw up a list of events and ceremonies, etc., associated to 1916. And I think the government is very sensitive. The current government is very sensitive to the way in which they're going to handle that. And I know that some of the families of the men of 1916, they're unhappy at the moment about the fact that they haven't been made as inclusive a part of this as they would wish to be, and they feel that they have a certain position because of the fact that they are families of those people who did fight in 1916. So it's a very sensitive one, and I think it's a delicate one that needs to be handled in a way that gives full credence to what happened. I mean, there are people like John Bruton and company, you know, who are arguing that this was an act of violence, that the men of 1916 had no democratic mandate. It's true, they didn't. They weren't voted in by anyone. They decided upon themselves, a small group of, Bruton would say, extremists who launched this violent revolution in 1918 without any mandate from the Irish people. And I mean, Bruton is somebody who said he was arguing we shouldn't be commemorating this act of violence because this led on to more violence, etc., etc.
Bruton's views in recent times have been dismissed across the board.
I have, yeah. But it's just a voice, it's a voice there. So they still have, the Irish government still hasn't come up with a programme of events. They're still pondering what they're going to do, and I think it does need to be handled sensitively, while at the same time giving full recognition and credence to what came about as a result of Easter 1916.
There's a gentleman here who wants to comment.
Ken Thompson from Belfast, like yourself. Would it be fair to say that Irishmen joined the British Army, not only from the Irish side, but actually within British regiments. When I was living in Newcastle, I did notice that Mary McAleese in 2006 had acknowledged the Irish regiment within the Northumberland Fusiliers.
Yes.
So effectively, like, it wasn't necessarily an Irish thing with a PAL system. Like, I think would it correct in saying that was British-wide?
It was because I had a good friend of mine. I'm involved in Northern Irish Rugby Club, and a good friend of mine who died there 25 years ago. He was from Derry, but he was living in London at the time, and he joined the London Irish Rifles, who were almost exclusively Irishmen living in London. And in Newcastle, you had another regiment, the Newcastle Irish, the Tyneside Irish, if they were called, who joined. So there were, and of course there were Irishmen who were living in America who then joined up when the American troops started coming here started coming to France in April 1917, and you had Irish in Australia as well, and Canada who joined up. So it wasn't just the Irish in Ireland, but it was, as you mentioned, the Irish in Britain as well. Yeah.
Thanks. We've not had a question from this side at all, have we? Would anybody on this side like to ask a question?
Yeah.
Yes, this gentleman down
Michael
there.
Roddickson.
Sorry.
We talk about divisions, 36 to 10 to 16.
Yeah.
But what numbers are we talking about? You hear the massive casualties of the First World War.
Yes.
But what numbers joined up and what sort of casualty levels did they have in?
Overall, if you take people living in Ireland who joined up north and south, the figures were something like 200,000 Irishmen who served in the British Army during the First World War. And casualties, well, dead. Again, there is a bit of debate over what the exact figures were. Most people would put it between, most historians who have studied this in depth, would put it between 35 and 40,000 dead during the war. So those were the sort of figures, about 200,000 in total. Yeah. Spread over not just the ones in Irish regiments, but also include there were some others who joined other regiments as well. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Anybody, this gentleman over here is the
Yeah, Luke Donovan, Irish Network, Stevenage. Just a question on Sinn Féin. How did it get so popular in getting 73 seats and form a government, if you like, when we never heard of them up till then?
That's right.
What actually happened to get that?
Well, Sinn Féin, who, as you rightly say, had no seats in 1914, the rising was called in the British newspapers the Sinn Féin Rising, even though it wasn't Sinn Féin Rising, but it became known as the Sinn Féin Rising. And that stuck. I mean, the rising was by the Irish Republican Brotherhood and the Citizen Army. And that stuck. And it was a big advantage to Sinn Féin that did stick. And then, of course, De Valera, eventually, Arthur Griffith, who had founded Sinn Féin, he then stood down and allowed De Valera to become president and chairman of Sinn Féin. And of course, Dev had been one of the few surviving leaders of 1916. And of course, with the martial law that had been imposed upon Ireland, with the executions, with the lack of home rule, as I mentioned, with all the thousands of house searches that were going on, with the threat of conscription, all this was turning Irish people away from the Irish Parliamentary Party and into the hands of Sinn Féin. I mean, British government policy wasn't clever. It wasn't deliberately, but it seemed as though it almost deliberately designed to turn people from the constitutionalists onto the revolutionary party. That's what Dillon had said, He said, you're destroying my party by your policies here. The other point that's important to make about the election of 1918 was at that election, of course, the Irish electorate was trebled because it was an election where the first time women had the vote, all women over the age of 30, and of course women up until then hadn't voted, and all men over the age of 21 had the vote, which hadn't been the case earlier. So the Irish electorate in 1918 went up from something like 700,000 to about 2 million. So it was trebled. And as a result of that, you had a whole series of young voters coming in, and of course women coming in, who had never voted before. The Irish Parliamentary Party was it was a tired party. I mean, John Dillon, its leader, was an old man who had been there with Parnell back in the 1880s, Joe Devlin similarly. Whereas the leaders of Sinn Féin were young. I mean, Collins was only 28, I think, in 1918. De Valera, I think, was 34. I mean, they were all part of a new, young generation, and they appealed to the new voters in Ireland. And the Irish Parliament, the image, the spin doctor, if there had been spin doctors, you know, they would have, the image that the Irish Parliamentary Party gave to this new electorate was not an attractive one. It was passé, it was out of date, it was old-fashioned, you know.
Jerry, I'll let you come back in now.
Oh, sorry, that sounds like the present day with the SDLP and Sinn Féin. The other thing is this, did anyone see the cenotaph in London this year with the Irish ambassador laying the poppies, green poppies? It's just always a nice touch.
Yes, that's right. No, I didn't see it, but I saw he did a green poppy, yeah.
Anybody else like to put a question from anywhere?
Sorry.
Yes, this lady.
A question on the economy. What was happening in the Irish economy? Just looking at the poor African people with all the conflicts, what it causes, such terrible poverty when they're dealing with other things. And obviously Ireland was trying to get on our feet at the time. And, you know, the internal and external conflicts, what was happening with the economy, how did that all affect?
Well, the economy on the whole during the war benefited in that there was a great need for agricultural produce. And of course, Ireland was overwhelmingly a rural agricultural economy, and therefore farmers on the whole and agricultural wages rose during those 4 years of war. And in Northern Ireland, for example, there was a lot of employment in the shipyards, as Harland and Wolff were turning out ships, in the engineering factories, and the rope works, the linen works, etc. So from the point of view of, and of course this helped women as well, because a lot of men had joined up in the army, and so women were moving into occupations which previously had been, many of which had previously been denied to them because there weren't the opportunities. So overall, I mean, Ireland, during those 4 years of war, the Irish economy actually benefits considerably from that.
Thanks.
There's one little interesting little footnote I would add to it. I spent most of my career in St Mary's University in Strawberry Hill, and there's an interesting story about one student from there. In the peace treaty was signed, the Anglo-Irish Treaty was signed in December 1921, you know, which divided Ireland into 26 counties and 6 counties in the north. And of course, after December 1921, there were severe sectarian riots in Belfast, and many Catholics actually were. Some Protestants were killed, but the overwhelming number were Catholics who were killed during those sectarian riots. It was a bit like the early Troubles, if you like. Over a two-year period, something like 350 people were killed in the north of Ireland, most of it in Belfast. And at that time, the Northern Ireland government, the new Northern Ireland government, came into power at Stormont, and they had set up a special police force, the B Specials, which had been set up by a man called Henry Wilson, or Sir Henry Wilson. And Sir Henry Wilson had been Chief of the Imperial General Staff during the First World War, and then had gone over to Northern Ireland, and he had been the advisor to the new Northern Ireland government, and in particular setting up the B Specials. But in June 1922, this is now 6 months after the treaty had been signed, Sir Henry Wilson was going into his house in Eaton Square in London, and there were 2 people waiting for him, a man called Joseph O'Sullivan, another was called Reginald Dunn, and they shot him on the steps of his house and killed him. And they were both, Reginald Dunn was the leader of the London Battalion of the IRA. They were both expert soldiers. Joseph O'Sullivan had fought at Ypres and had lost a leg actually at Ypres, and Reginald Dunn was an Irishman who had come over to England and had joined the British Army and joined the Irish Guards actually. And they shot Henry Wilson, and they couldn't get away because Joseph O'Sullivan had a bad leg, so they were both caught and they were put on trial and were found guilty of murder, and they were hanged in Pentonville jail. But the interesting thing, the reason I'm saying this to you, is that Reginald Dunn was actually a student at St Mary's. So I think he's the only St Mary's student to have been hanged, to my knowledge, and he had been training as a teacher, because some of the soldiers in the British Army, when they came out, they were offered an accelerated teaching qualification. You could do it in 2 years, and that was what he was doing. That's what he was doing at the time. And why they did it is still uncertain. You know, whether because Henry Wilson was a hate figure to many people because of what had happened in Northern Ireland with the B specials and the pogroms that had gone on in Belfast, and whether they had done it off their own bat, or whether Michael Collins, who of course was running the IRA at the time, and Collins did have a death sentence on Sir Henry Wilson. This is prior now to the treaty being signed, but of course once the treaty was signed in December 1921, all hostilities were supposed to cease. And Collins had visited London apparently and spoken to Dunn, but there's no actual evidence, you know, of whether Collins had said to Dunn, okay, let's go and get Wilson and, you know, bump him off, or whether the two of them had done it simply as a sort of a private operation, if you like. But anyway, in the heat of the hunt, they both were hanged and were buried in Pentonville jail, and they remained buried there actually until 1967, when their bodies were exhumed and they were brought back to Ireland, and they're buried in a graveyard, I think, just outside Dublin. Anyway, it's an interesting little vignette.
Is that about the time that Collins was playing Gaelic football for Geraldines in London?
Well, he was earlier, yeah, that's right. That was before that. That was before 1914. Yeah, I think he knew them at that stage. I think actually. Yeah.
Can I just make a comment then? I was brought up in Ireland. I was taught Irish history till about the age of 14. Came over here. We were taught all about Sinn Féin, all about the history of the revolution, but we were taught nothing broader. I come over here and realised that they'd never mentioned 2 world wars. It was that biased. And you know, we're angry now because I'm very angry that I wasn't given whole truth about it. And cross should have been. And now we're learning our history from down to now. So your presentation here tonight, has sort of brought information and helped to a lot of us. You know, the other thing, the logistics of that war as well. And you presented the history brilliantly, but there's a human side to this as well. And I'm asking questions like, how did get them all back? Where are they buried? Were they buried? A lot of them are buried out there.
But the first all buried out there.
And they wouldn't have been in graves, would they? They would have been building.
Some were buried in mass graves. I don't know whether any of you have visited. I used to take my students to visit the battlefields of the First World War. But nearly always they buried them close to where they were. Where they fell.
Yeah. And then bringing them back. I suppose people who were injured were brought back. It must have been.
Oh yes, they were.
How on earth did they get them back? To get from that war zone to the ships to bring them back to hospitals.
Well, of course,
that must have been really difficult.
Yeah, but of course a lot of them didn't make it. A lot of them, the ones who were badly wounded died
on the way. Yeah. And that's more of it that we weren't told. I'd say the English people weren't told that one. We weren't told all about the wars. Then when they did come back, some of them were so badly injured, they were finished anyway. How were they looked after when they were brought back? Were there pensions? There was no National Health Service.
There were pensions.
There was no National Health Service, though, was there? So they could have died at home of their injuries.
Yeah, there were war pensions, and the war pensions were paid. It is true that even in Britain, you know, the whole idea of shell shock wasn't really, it was acknowledged to some extent. Pat Barker, the British novelist, has written about it, about Siegfried Sassoon and Wilfred Owen going to a psychiatric hospital up in Scotland. So there was some beginnings of understanding about, you know, what is now called post-traumatic stress. But in Ireland, there was very little. I mean, the Irish soldiers came back, and I mean, not only were they in some ways ostracized, but also there were many who, well, you know, many were wounded physically, but a lot of them were wounded mentally and emotionally, and there was no treatment for that whatsoever.
And the
in
mental
Ireland.
health service didn't come into 1945. So was there proper care for them? I don't see how it could have been.
No, there wasn't.
And the other thing about that one I want to show, it went through all classes, didn't it? From the top to the bottom took part in it. The higher up, they all died, more or less, from top to bottom.
Yeah,
And other wars didn't have
the
that.
biggest casualties actually were the second lieutenants and captains,
Yeah.
because the top brass never got involved. Obviously, they were safely behind the lines, as they always are in wars. And it was the foot soldiers, the corporal, but in particular the young officers, the second lieutenants and the captains. And it actually affects Ireland because it affected the Anglo-Irish gentry, you know, who during the 18th century and first half of the 19th century, you know, had been one of the key elements of Irish society, and they were the sort of natural leaders, political and social leaders of Ireland. Now their position was becoming eroded with the Land Acts and their loss of land and their loss of social influence. But many of them, because they were Anglo-Irish, they had this tradition of volunteering in the British Army, and many of the sons of the Anglo-Irish families did volunteer in the British Army and did die. So it was the end really of that Anglo-Irish section of Irish society, which had been very prominent, had a very prominent role in Ireland for 300 years.
Thanks very much for clearing that up. Will I let Jerry back? How are we for time?
Can I just say what you mentioned, history in school. History stopped dead in 1921 with the signing of the treaty.
Yep.
After that, neither Fine Gael or Fianna Fáil or any other government gave you anything after that. It stopped dead.
Yeah, I went to the Christian Brothers in Belfast, and my history stopped in 1921 too.
And you get angry.
Yeah, that's what, yeah, I understand.
I went to St Paul's College in Derry, and we learned our history through English books. Lord was the historian. I don't think we ever understood anything that went on. It was I think, although I'm a practicing Catholic, I have to say that the Catholic Church in Ireland were a disgrace. They were establishment orientated, and they didn't want to rock the boat. And we were brought up not to rock the boat.
When I was young, there was an old man was telling me that he didn't elaborate too much. He was saying there was a lot of propaganda used by the British to get Irishmen to join, i.e. they were anti-Catholic, the Germans were. He didn't elaborate too much on it. So was the propaganda to get Irish people to join?
Oh, it was.
Apart from home rule.
Oh, there was, absolutely. I mean, there was the recruiting posters at the beginning of the war concentrated very much upon Belgium, a Catholic country, and look what the Germans were doing to this small Catholic country, very much like Ireland, roughly the same population. And so it was the duty of Irish Catholics to go and rally behind, and there were stories in the newspapers of nuns being raped, etc., by German soldiers. Certainly at the beginning of the war, there was an attempt to play upon that propaganda. Well, I mean, the recruiting posters all over. And if you ever go to the Imperial War Museum, you can see an example of these posters, and they're very well done. I mean, they had a terrific effect. When people walked out on the streets and saw these posters all over the place, and why have you not signed up? You know, your mate has signed up. What's wrong with you? There's something wrong with you that you haven't signed up. So there was certainly pressure, being put as much as possible upon people to join.
Jerry, this will have to be the last one.
I always believed that was false propaganda about German soldiers killing women, children, and old people. But recently, in the last few months, in the Irish Times, it has come out that this was true. This did happen when the Germans moved in. They did kill civilians.
There were civilians, yeah. But then, but you see that happens in every war. You know, I mean, look, you know, when guns are being fired, you know, 2 miles down the line, who knows where the shell's going to land?
Up close and personal.
There were civilians killed, and certainly by the church. Some of the German troops did not behave in a way that befits sort of if you like,
but they had a history of
a fully disciplined.
They had a history that's gone back hundreds of years.
Yeah.
You know, you look at the French, what happened in 1871 and that, they went in and slaughtered everybody. Especially if you were educated, they killed you.
why he left us alone, he went just one here very quickly, because
Was it true that the 1914 war, that the British were not prepared enough, as the Germans were?
That's true. That's true. Germany had a very large army. The Russians had a very large army. The Austro-Hungarians had a very large army. The British army, at the outbreak of the war, I think it was around about 100,000, because it was part of the British tradition not to have a large standing army. What Britain depended upon for its defence, because it was an island, was its navy, and Britain had the largest navy in the world. So therefore, I mean, Britain only interfered in European affairs militarily when it was absolutely necessary to do so. I mean, the last time the British had interfered in Europe was the Crimean War, 1854-56. And I mean, armies are expensive things to maintain, so Britain never wanted to have a large standing army. But the Navy, yes, and as long as the British Navy was the greatest Navy in the world, the biggest Navy in the world, and the strongest Navy in the world, Britain as an island felt safe. Yeah. So in that sense, the army was not equipped to go and fight a prolonged 4-year war. That's why the army, Kitchener then had to get this volunteer army, which had to be trained very quickly and then sent over to France. And it was that volunteer army, of course, that most of it was wiped out of the Somme. Yeah, so I mean, your answer is, in terms of having a standing army to fight on land, yeah, Britain wasn't equipped in 1914 for that.
So can we all say a couple of verses of Rule Britannia?
I'd like to say a big thank you to Jim for coming down and doing this presentation tonight. I'm sure you've all Also, thanks to the members of the Cultural Seminar Planning Group. Thank you to them as well. There's a few of them not here. There's another first time where they put a lot of work into this. And finally, thank you for braving the cold weather to join us this evening. Thanks very much.